All right, the clock on my wall says 3 o'clock. Time to start the webinar. Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Clossy, Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's webinar featuring Connie Harrington talking about the biology and management of Oregon white oak. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute and to the Clackamas Extension for sponsoring this, for leading this project, and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover our expenses. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled the first and third Tuesday of every month at 3 p.m. from now until June 15th. And then we'll take a break over the summer, and looks like we'll probably be starting up again in September, but we'll have to see. We realized today with the ice and snow, the storms that we've had and the power outages that are around, that many of the people that were registered will not be able to join us, but the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the knowyourforest.org Tree School Online page. But I see we've got over 40 people here, so not bad, and I know you'll join us. So by now, most of you are familiar with Zoom webinars, but I want to just do a quick review for you just of some of the features. At the bottom of your screen, or on, if you have an Apple, it might be on the top, is the Zoom toolbar. And this has most of the buttons that are useful. You'll notice that your audio is muted, that you don't have video in the webinar format. Those are not available. However, there is probably the first box you see is the Q&A box. And this is where we ask, since you don't have access to talking to us, this is how we ask you to communicate your questions to Connie, is in the Q&A box. You can write them in there and then also see the questions that other people have asked. You'll notice next to that is the chat box. The chat we use to communicate to you. So you'll notice that we set in there that the webinar is started and that it's being recorded and where the recordings are going to be available at. So we try to post in there to give you information and want you to ask your questions in the Q&A. The one thing different than that is if you're having some technical problems, put that in the Q&A. Put technical stuff in the chat rather than the Q&A. There are resources for the program that Connie has provided, and they will be posted on the resource tab on the Tree School Online page on Know Your Forest. They're not up yet because one of the people that's down with ice and snow and no power is Amanda Brenner of Clackamas Extension, who is our posting person. So they'll get posted as soon as Amanda gets access to her computer. But the webinar is being recorded and that will be posted sooner because Jordan Benner, who does that, does have it. The final thing before I introduce Connie is I want to mention polls. We have a couple of places in the webinar that we have polls to get your feedback. One is at the beginning and the other is at the end. And a poll box should pop up, a pop-up menu in the middle of your screen with the questions that you just click on to answer. If that doesn't happen, at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar, there's a poll button. That should light up and then you click on it and it will open. So hopefully it'll work like that. You never know. One thing I've learned in webinars and in life in general is to expect the unexpected. But I do expect we'll have a great webinar today. So I'd like to ask Connie to turn on her video and unmute, and I will introduce her. So Connie Harrington is a retired researcher, research forester from the PNW Research Station in Olympia. She has her bachelor's and master's from the State University in New York and a PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. So she's a Husky, so that's good. And she's been doing great research. My whole career, it seems Connie's been around as a researcher doing silviculture research Really cutting edge stuff. She also is a tree school veteran. She traditionally at the Clackamas Tree School teaches one class on Oregon white oak and one class on Western red cedar. And I've been to both of them. They're both great. She's already done the red cedar as a webinar, so it's on our recorded. You can go to it on the greatest hits list. And today she's going to do biology and management of Oregon white oak. So welcome, Connie.
Technical difficulty.
Uh-oh. Can you not hear?
I'm going to stop sharing and start again.
Okay. It's stuck.
It was stuck.
Sometimes you just need, if you click on it and then try advancing it, it'll work. Because if you've clicked on anything else, Zoom remembers your last click. Perfect. So why don't you go to your first slide, Connie, and tell us about what you're going to tell us about.
I'm trying to go to my first slide.
Okay, click in the picture and then try to advance it.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the hint, Mike. Yeah, so as Mike said, I'm going to talk about biology and management of Oregon white oak today. And I've worked on a lot of different species. I like to think that although I think Douglas fir is a wonderful species, and I've done a lot of research on Douglas fir, I also like to research and share with people information about a lot of the species in the Northwest that I think are kind of neglected. There hasn't been a lot of research and there hasn't been a lot of information, and oak has definitely fit into that category. So, so sometimes people want to jump right into the management, but I like to give a little background. So we're going to talk a little bit about biology and some other aspects.
Right. Before you kick in though, Connie, I want to do the poll, find out about our audience. So I'm launching the poll, and the first question has to do, this should have popped up on your screen. Where are you from? Willamette Valley, Coastal Oregon, Southwest, Central or Eastern Oregon, Washington State, USA, outside USA. Then about yourself, are you a woodland owner, private natural resource professional, agency natural resource professional, nonprofit, other? How many acres do you own? 0 up to 1,000 plus. And you've seen these all questions before, those of you that are veterans, but we have 2 questions that are specifically about white oak. Have you released oak from overtopping competition or thinned oak stands? And have you planted or seeded oak? And if so, you can say no, less than 100, 100 to 500, or 500 plus. And I like to let these polls go for about a minute or so, or until 80% have voted. Right now, 53% of you have voted. So please vote. And I won't do my Jeopardy music. That's when it gets a little slow. But they're coming along up to 68%. We've got some definite trends developing. Oh, there we go. Somebody has planted more than 500. Good. I knew they were waiting. They were counting on their fingers. How many have I planted? And they got there. All right. 74%. We're going to hit a minute and a half soon. I'm 76%. Come on, 78%. We can do it. Nope. We're going to end the polling and share. So what we found out is 58% are from the Willamette Valley, some from Southwest Oregon, quite a few from Washington State. Must be because they know Connie up there. 23% from Washington State, only 1 from outside the US. Again, 40% are woodland owners, but 35% are agency natural resource professionals. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could be more than one of these. So this is, again, higher than average on our natural resource professionals. Also kind of going with that, 28% don't have any acres that they own or manage. They help others manage theirs. Yes, more than half the people have thinned or released overtopped stands from competition. 68% haven't done any seeding or planting, but that means that 32% have, and most of it less than 100. So it sounds like a group that has done a lot of thinning and not much planting, Connie. So
Okay.
that's a good place to start. Take it away, and I will see you at halftime for some Q&A. And just remind people that if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Thanks, Connie.
Okay, Mike, it's frozen again. What happened? All right. Okay, we're back in business now. So I just like to always bring up talking about names. We're talking about the species that's Quercus garryana, scientific name. I learned it as Oregon white oak. Some people call it Garry oak. Um, Interestingly, Garry oak seems to be more common for people from Canada and also more common with ecologists. And Oregon white oak is used more by foresters. Um, but there are other names that are used, and of course, a lot of people just call it oak. Oregon white oak has a fairly long north-south distribution from Vancouver Island to down into California. Um, some of you may be aware that there are other species of oak in Oregon and down in California. And in many cases, if we don't have information on one oak species, we'll kind of borrow from what we know for another oak species. So, oak. Why do people like oak? And I think the fact that you're here is an indication that you're interested in oak, and you probably have several reasons why you think why you're interested in oak. And some people just like the open space that it provides in a conifer landscape, but others are interested in the wildlife aspects. It's definitely a cultural legacy from Native American burning, but it's been ignored or managed against for years by both foresters and landowners who just didn't have information about the species. It's an interesting species because there's a real sense of urgency that a lot of the oak has been overtopped, and there are non-native plants. But on the other hand, there's also a sense of community, and often there's a lot of projects that involve volunteers. So it really differs from the types of reasons that people will talk about managing conifers. So the Native Americans used acorns and other prairie-associated plants as food sources. They kept areas open with fire for both hunting and also for plant production. Um, and it's currently, the oak area is currently an important tie with traditional uses. Um, Many cases, people talk about how important it is to get the elders out in the places where they can um, both collect acorns and harvest other traditional plants. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground today. A little bit about biology and ecology, some talk about growth models, release from overtopping and thinning. And I was interested to see how many of you have had some experience in this. Then we'll stop for some questions. Then we'll go into regeneration. So talk about the planting, um, insects and disease, other activities, um, talk about some other information sources that will be in that resources document that Mike mentioned. And then we'll have another question session. So as I mentioned with the map, it has a long north-south range, and this means that it can grow in very diverse climates, from cool or cold to very hot. It can actually be found up near some of the passes, down near the coast, on very dry areas. It grows on a really wide range of soils and habitats, but on better sites, it's often overtopped. And some people think of it as mostly a dry site species, but it can occur in both very dry and very wet sites, and soils in between. The flowers appear with the new leaves in the spring. It's male and female flowers are on the same tree, so biologists call it monoecious. Acorns develop in 1 year, So from the flowers that come out in the spring, those would be the acorns in the fall. And that's typical of white oaks. This deep taproot, well-developed laterals, so it's wind firm under most conditions. Um, it's intolerant of shade. It really likes those sunny areas, but it will be kind of intermediate in tolerance when it's young. So I've always been interested in roots, and here you can see an oak tree. See its roots, so you can see this large taproot going down, and then where the pink arrow is where the taproot has gotten very small and turned sideways, and that's actually an area where the root hit a compacted soil layer, compacted till, and didn't go any further. Roots can be quite wide spreading. So here we had a little sapling, and we did some excavation and then painted the roots that were exposed with this bright pink just to make them more visible. And you can see that this kind of yardstick is actually a little bit wider than the crown or the leaves on this little tree. But in fact, the root going off to the right goes much further than the crown. So it's kind of a common misunderstanding. A lot of people think that the roots are, basically go out as far as the crown of the tree, but in fact, they can often go out much further than that. And the roots, I call them plastic, just meaning they can move in different ways. In this case, this root turned to the left and then went down because there was a big rock in the way. So the tree roots in general tend to do those kinds of things, but oak is particularly good at it. So acorn production is affected by a lot of different things, and I'll talk about some of those in a little bit, but just wanted to show you that there's some regional patterns in acorn production. So for example, looks like 2004 was generally a good year, and that was in North Puget Sound, or it was down Whetstone Savanna down in Southern Oregon. So some sites are going to be better producers than others, but if it's a good year on some sites, it's often going to be a good year kind of region-wide. So growth of oak trees and acorn production tend to be correlated with crown volume. And in this case, I've kind of circled around the volume of the crown of the tree. So you can see the tree on the right has a much longer crown and a somewhat wider crown, whereas the one on the left has got a very small crown. So when we first started thinking about acorn production, we really weren't sure what would be the most effective. Do you want to grow trees like on the left that I call a hand tree? That's like if you put your hand out and spread your fingers and then drew around all your fingers, that could be the crown of that tree. Whereas if they're all close together, and then you just trace around your fingernails, then that's part of the tree that would be having the branches, the crown. And we found that the hand trees, have much better growth rates and much greater acorn production. So if you're thinking that you're interested in acorn production for wildlife use, you really need to think about how you can produce these hand trees rather than the fingernail trees. So trees, their form, the problems they have are really a factor of both management, decisions, and also tree biology. So in this picture that we see in front of us, um, the area in front of the oaks has been kept open by burning. So you can see that the trees are pretty much open grown, and there's not a lot of understory plants. But behind them, there's Douglas fir, and you can see that the Douglas fir has much greater maximum height. So if they happen to be mixed together, you can see how the Douglas fir would become much taller than the oak. So what happens when they get mixed together is the oak slowly starts losing its crown. So individual branches start dying. Um, Often the tree itself will take a long time to die, or you could say that it dies in pieces. So individual branches die. And then often, even if all the main branches have died, sometimes there's a few sprouts that will survive. So when you actually talk about, how long it takes to die, sometimes in terms of actual death, it takes a really long time. But it doesn't take long at all once trees are crowded and overtopped for individual branches to start dying. So I want to briefly talk about growth models, kind of population dynamics. And when I talk about this in person at tree school, and I put up this slide, you can just see people go, I'm not interested in growth models and population dynamics. Um, but hopefully you really are. You just haven't really thought of it that way. Because I see that these growth models can help predict stand development, including this mortality, help people and organizations prioritize stands to be treated, um, and what kind of urgency there is for action, and help evaluate alternative scenarios, including the do nothing scenario. So sometimes people think, oh, Connie's from Washington, she's up in Olympia, that's where her data would come from. But in fact, we've gotten data that we use in growth models that came from a lot of different sources, like the Forest Inventory, um, Forest Service Inventory Program. And there's data you can see from California, Oregon, as well as Washington. In fact, we have a lot less data from Washington than from the other two states. So what can happen with these growth models is we can input a stand. In this case, the oaks are the orange, and the conifer, the Douglas fir, green. And we can have different size trees, so different diameters and different crown dimensions. We can say, okay, we start off in year 0 with a one-storied stand. What will it look like in 50 years? So here's this one-story stand without removal. The Douglas fir has continued to grow. The oak has been overtopped. Most of them have died. There's some surviving, but they have very small crowns, and they're not very happy. If we start off and we have a two-storied stand, and I've seen a lot of these in the region, and people say, oh yeah, we still have oak. It's really pretty, really like the oak that we have in our woods. But in the future, this is what those stands would look like. The overwhelming majority of the trees are going to die, and those that are left are going to be very inconspicuous and certainly not serving the roles that most people would like to have oak serve. On the other hand, if we actually have a one-storied stand and we remove the Douglas fir, in 50 years, we're going to have oaks. Oak is a very long-lived species. It can live several hundred years. So, so it's worth considering what things look like now and what you'd like them to look like in the future. So another thing that we can look at with these growth models is predict mortality. And in this case, it's a function of two main factors. One is the basal area down at the bottom, which is a measure of stand density, with larger numbers indicating a lot more, a lot denser stand. And this particular one is going up to 200, but in fact, in conifer stands, you could have much higher numbers, but up to 200 is kind of as high as you might find oak. And then the other axis is relative height. And so you can see the relative height of the oak in relation to the other trees. So the lower the relative height is, the faster the trees are going to die. So you can see it's telling you the 10-year probability of mortality. So if we are at a relative height of 1 and we have a basal area of 50, then maybe 3% of the trees are going to die in 10 years. But if we're down at a relative height of, say, 0.5, or the oaks are only half as tall as the conifers, and our basal area is out, say, 150, then we're going to lose like 60% of the, we're going to lose like 10% of the trees in the next 10 years. And then, of course, in the next 10 years, our relative height will be even less because the Douglas firs continue to grow, whereas the oak has probably stopped growing in height, and the basal area will continue to grow. So the next 10 years, the probability of mortality is going to be even greater. So I'd like to tell you briefly about a study that we put in called the Oak Release Study. And this was one put in Oregon, put in Washington, but we've also had some cooperators in Oregon that have put in similar treatments and had very similar responses. So in this case, we had 4 sites. Each site we selected 18 overtopped oak trees on each of the sites. And then we applied 3 release treatments, and I'll show you pictures of those in a minute. And then we measured the oak tree growth, acorn production, and epicormic branches, and I'll tell you more about those in a minute. So this study was taking place in a primarily conifer stand. The Douglas fir, 60 to 80 years old. The oak was actually older, 90 to 130 years old. So the oak was there first, but had been slowly but surely crowded in and overtopped. So the landowner, in this case it was Joint Base Lewis McCord, had a basic stand level conifer thinning in which they cut 2 trees in a plot. And in this case, the plot radius was equal to the height of the center oak tree. So this kind of orangey color in the middle that has a C, that was the center oak tree in the plot. And if it was 70 feet tall, then the radius of the plot was 70 feet. And you can see just the 2 kind of ghost outlines. Those were the Doug fir that were cut. And then we did a treatment called half release, and we released the conifers that were within half of the oak's height. So if we had a 60-foot tall tree, we removed the Douglas fir within 30 feet, plus having this background thinning. And in this case, on average, we removed 6 Douglas fir. And then we removed, in our full release treatment, we removed all the conifers within the height of the oak tree. So in this case, it was an average of 15 trees. And sometimes people will say, well, why didn't you do the treatments in relation to the height of the Douglas fir? And it's like, well, this was just this particular trial, and we didn't know how successful we were going to be. So we didn't want to create large openings in the stand in which there weren't any trees remaining. So in some cases, you may very well want to remove the conifers in a much larger area than in the oaks. But when we first started this 20 years ago, we were being conservative. So just showing you those 3 treatments again. So initially, we had our fingers crossed, hope that this was going to go well. It's one thing to design something on paper, but what happens when treatment meets the real world. But in this case, all the study trees survived the thinning. There's some broken branches um, on the oaks, a little bit of bark knocked off here and there. Some conifer branches were lodged in the oak crowns, but nothing problem. And the operators really didn't have any trouble implementing the prescriptions. I will say that um, the operators were all made very aware that the purpose of doing this um, release or doing this thinning was to benefit the oak. So it was really important to not damage the oaks. And I think a lot of the fellers take great pride in their ability to put trees where they want them. And so when it was clear to them what we really wanted to achieve, they really did a good job and did not smash up all the oak trees. So tell you a little bit about the 10-year results. First, looking at diameter growth. Initially, we've got 3 sets of bars in this case. The first 3 years, in which the bar furthest to the left in each group is the thin only or control. And then we have the half release and the full release. And you can see that there was an increase in the diameter growth with the degree of release. And when we get out 4 to 5 years after treatment, the effect, particularly of that full release, is greater than it was the first few years. So if you look at the release just early on, yes, it was beneficial, but it improved as we went further on. So just looking at it another way, rather than just a treatment, we can see how the maximum growth is based on the spatial area or competition close to the tree. So in some cases, you could have a thin only treatment that wasn't as dense as some of the others, or you could have a half release that actually had fairly low competition. So what's really important is not just the name that you give a treatment, but actually what competition is that remains. And it's really important to focus on reducing that competition. So if we look at 10-year height growth and 10-year crown area increment, the height growth was the greatest in the thin only or the control treatment and less in the others. And sometimes people are surprised at that and they think that the thinning treatments should always increase the height growth. But in fact, these older trees are not growing very much in height. It's a pretty small number. And really what they're doing in the half release and full release treatment is they're expanding their crowns. So you can see a little bit of that in the graph below, where the full release treatment is starting to have a larger crown than the thin treatment. Then I mentioned epicormic branches. Epicormic branches are branches that arise from buds underneath the bark. So these were buds that you just don't normally see. Those are not the buds that are at the end of the branch, but those that are coming from underneath the bark. And if we look at the control treatment, which did have a light thinning, there were some new epicormic branches, but not very many, an average of only 2 per tree. Whereas if we look at the full release, now we're talking about like 10 branches per tree, and most of them come out very quickly after the release treatment starts. So epicormic branches really help trees rebuild crowns. And so particularly when you have trees that have just a narrow little crown at the top, these epicormic branches are really important. I know a lot of foresters were trained to think that epicormic branches were bad because they could reduce log quality. But in fact, for releasing oaks, epicormic branches are really beneficial. So what will the crowns of released trees look like in the future? um, we'll see. But I don't think that epicormics get the respect they deserve. One thing we did see is epicormic branches having acorns on them 3 years after treatment, so they can definitely uh, be functioning like a normal branch very quickly after they are formed. So the question is, what is this tree on the left going to turn into one on the right? Well, um, probably not. Certainly not in my lifetime. But one of the things that we did see was that the epicormics um, really start filling in this lower part of the crown. So this area that's within 20 feet, um, 30 feet above the ground, you start to get a lot more branches in the trees that are released. So they're really able to start building crown toward the bottom of the tree, which is really going to, I think, have very dramatic effects on crown shape long term. Now, a lot of people just don't think about epicormic branches except maybe where something was damaged, like if there was road construction, or a power line went through. Sometimes you'll see a lot of epicormic branches on the side of trees, particularly some species. But just as an example, looking at the Douglas fir old growth trees that were measured from the Wind River canopy crane, they said in 2/3 of the study trees, more than a third of the total number of live branches in these old growth trees were epicormic in origin. And they occurred throughout the crown and accounted for most of the branches in the lower crown. So the idea that some people have that epicormic branches are these little pin branches or are only going to be tiny branches is really not true. I think they have the potential to become large branches and form a major part of the future crown. So acorn production, interestingly, it's quite variable from year to year. And in this case, we did a 60-second acorn count. So we had binoculars and we're zooming around looking at the tree for 60 seconds and doing a count. And in some years, like say year 5 after treatment, there are almost no acorns on any tree. On the other hand, year 4 after treatment, you can see that the trees that were released are having more acorn production. So a lot of variation from year to year, but if it is a year that favors acorn production, the full release is definitely going to, those trees are going to give you the best acorn production. And so just another way of looking at it, if we have a high producing year, the full release is going to produce about 3 times as many acorns as the control or thin only. So we've been talking about the release treatment as what we see on the left. So if you had an oak and then you remove some conifers directly above or around it. But whether or not that's what you want to do really is going to depend on what you have to start with and what your management objectives are. So sometimes people say, well, I really like to keep the oak in my stand as much as possible, but I really want to still have conifer production or value. And so, yes, I'll go and release a few oaks, but I'm not going to be turning it into an oak stand. On the other hand, you have people who have situations like on the right, in which the Douglas fir has come into what was an oak savanna and has been growing and overtopping those oaks. And someone might say, yeah, I'd like to move that forest edge, the conifer edge, back so that we have oaks all along where we have this oak savanna before. And so it's really a question of what you have to start with and what your management objectives are. And I always tell people, just because I'm showing you the results from a particular study doesn't mean that's what I think you should be doing in your stand. So this is just an example of looking at some different landscape alternatives of a joint base Lewis McChord. And you can see the orange on the left, or the image on the left was where we had a prairie in the foreground, that tan area. And then where we had the little bits of orange where there was oak. And the images on the right are a couple different alternatives in terms of adding additional, recreating past prairie, releasing different levels of oak. And just depends on what you have to start with and what your short and long-term objectives are. So a question that people ask quite a bit is, should you focus the efforts of releasing just on the south side of the tree? And I say no. Release oaks on all sides in most cases, because below ground competition is on all sides. So if you're releasing just on the top, on one side, you've increased the light level, but you still have a lot of below ground competition. Plus, this diffuse light is really effective in illuminating foliage. And I know for most of us, particularly this time of year, if we're in a conifer stand and we walk out into the sunlight, we really appreciate that direct light. But diffuse light is really important, and it's very effective in supporting plant growth. And if you think about it, we wouldn't have any plants growing on north-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere if this diffuse light wasn't important, because they don't ever get any direct sunlight. And the same thing if you have a plant out, a tree out in an open area, in your yard or in the middle of a prairie, the branches wouldn't grow as well on the north side of the tree as on the south side if it was really important that they get direct light. So think about that next time you're looking at plants on a north slope or on the north side of a tree. So the ratio of direct to diffuse light varies with latitude and month. And, as we start fairly far north, maybe in the summer that would be 40 to 50%, the ratio of direct to diffuse light. Not as much in the winter, of course, but on the other hand, our oak trees don't have leaves on them in the winter. So anyway, remember, don't release just on the south side, but all the way around. In addition, if you make openings asymmetrical, it'll increase the tendency for trees to develop unbalanced crowns. So as the crown would continue to grow toward additional light, it's going to continue to become unbalanced, which is not what you want in the long term. Okay, so big trees are usually removed as part of a timber sale. So in this case, you can see a very branchy Douglas fir, a little oak kind of behind it to the left. And it's very branchy because it got started in a savanna or very open area. It's a very branchy tree, but those trees can be removed as part of a timber sale. But in some cases, if you're going to remove, you want to favor the oak, but you can have a Douglas fir growing right through the oak crown. And in that case, you can do a double girdle to kill the Douglas fir and still favor the oak. So do have a publication called A Practical Guide to Oak Release that we put out, 10, 15 years ago. And we've reprinted it. And so we have a fair number of paper copies. And usually when I come to tree school, I bring a whole box of publications. And so email me for a paper copy. And this, my email address will be in the resources for the class, so you don't have to all scribble it down. But please let me know if you would like a paper copy, and I'd be happy to email it to you. I mean, happy to mail it to you. So just basically a brief talk about thinning. In most cases, people have released oak from overtopping competition, but they haven't gone in and thinned in a stand that's predominantly oak. So I'm just going to give you one example of where we went into an oak stand that was all oak, but it was fairly dense. And we actually cut 89% of the stems and removed a little over half of the basal area. Hopefully you'll get the impression from listening to me that I'm in favor of relatively heavy-handed treatments when it comes to oak. So here, if we're looking at growth, we see a not thin stand on the left and one that was thinned on the right. And what you can see is in the unthinned stand, the not thin stand, the trees, the smaller trees, do not grow nearly as well in diameter growth as the larger trees. Whereas when you have a thin stand, which has really been opened up, then the trees in all the diameter classes are growing fairly similarly. And just looking a little further, that continues to hold that the thin stand, all the different diameter classes are growing similarly, whereas there's quite a difference in diameter growth in the different diameter classes in the unthin stand. And sometimes people say, well, how come that group of that 20 dBH class, and that's 20 centimeters, is actually growing better in the unthin stand? And it's just because there are only a couple trees, so it's a very small sample size. But just, growth continued to increase over time in both thinned and unthinned, but you can just see how much better the trees in the 10 and 15 centimeter classes are doing in the thin stand compared to the unthin stand. So when we did the thinning, we basically removed all the smaller trees and then also removed some of the kind of medium-sized trees. So people say, well, okay, if I start with something that's like on the left, where I have a bunch of clumps of oaks and a lot of dense oak stand, should I be removing clumps or should I thin within the clumps? And again, this depends on really what you're starting with in terms of numbers of trees and the size of them, and what you want it to look like in the future. But in dense stands, and certainly in that example I was showing, we remove both whole clumps and thin within the clumps. So in this case, when I said we removed 89% of the stems, you can see how we really removed a lot of stems. So as I've said a couple times, you really need to think about what you want the stand to look like in the future. In less dense stands, you remove some clumps or thin within clumps, but in dense stands, you're going to be removing both clumps and thin within them. And the same ideas apply to mixtures of oak with other species in terms of how much you remove, and it's just what you start with and really where you'd like to go in the future. Sometimes people say, well, I don't really want to get a logger in there. I think I can do things myself, particularly when it's thinning oak because they're relatively small. And I say, that's great. Um, get out there and do what you do good. Um, in some cases, especially with small stems of oak, you're probably just going to be leaving them on the ground. Um, but in some cases, you're going to want to yard them out and use them for firewood. Um, Sometimes people say, well, isn't it good to just leave all the stems on the ground for coarse woody debris? But these oak stands historically did not have a lot of coarse woody debris. They were frequently burned, and uh, there's in some cases it may be practical to leave a lot of stems on the ground, but don't do it because you think it's good for your oak stand. So, but there are ways that you can actually thin your own oak stand if you've got the right kind of heavy tractor, truck, whatever, so you can set up a portable winch and actually set up cables and have a skidding cone. So sometimes people ask me about producing wood for wine barrels, and certainly oak has historically been used for wine barrels, and for a lot of other things, flooring, other kinds of specialty woods. Um, but only the straightest, tightest wood can be used for barrels. So it can be quite valuable, but there's not a lot of it out there. So just, uh, if you have it, that's a great market. But if you don't have it, then just there's a lot of other things that oak can be used for. So I'm going to pause now and take some questions related to the first part of the
Right.
presentation.
Great, Connie. We do have some questions, but before I have you answer them, we're also getting a bit of noise, and I'm wondering if it might be on your end. So I was going to ask you to do a little experiment for me to do some noise reduction. So if you go over where your microphone is on the toolbar and click that up arrow, at the very bottom, the pop-up menu should be audio settings. If you click on that, you got that so far?
Yes.
Okay, over on the right side, the third one from the top of the dark bolded one says suppress background noise. And
Okay, it's on auto.
you put that on medium.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see if that makes any difference. The noise went away. So thank you. All right. So we do have some questions, and thank you all for sending in the questions. The first one is, you mentioned the hand versus the fingernail trees at towards the beginning, and that the hand trees tend to grow better because they have bigger crowns. The fingernail trees have smaller crowns. We had two questions relating to that. One is, with the fingernail trees, if you do thinning in that, will you get more epicormic branching because they don't have a lot of branches down low? So epicormic branching on fingernail trees versus hand trees.
Yes, you will.
Okay.
And in some traditional foresters would say, oh, you don't want epicormic branches, but on the fingernail trees, you have very little crown. So yes, you do want.
So that would be a good thing,
That
epicormic
would be a good
branching
thing to
on a
build more
fingernail
crown
tree.
in the future.
If it a pulling. Good. That's what we thought. But the other question is, your last slide on the wine barrel staves, those come from nice straight grown trees that tend to be fingernail trees. So it's kind of a trade-off between having the best trees for lumber quality versus having the healthiest trees.
Yes, definitely there is a trade-off between what you can produce, and um, you can't produce everything in the same stand.
Okay.
So the wine barrel trees or the flooring trees are primarily going to be from historical legacy from the past, where we had trees that were growing fairly close together. Um, but on the other hand, I have heard people say that they want to manage oak for their grandchildren, and they want to grow it at a relatively um, uh, tight spacing, and that they want to do thinning, and they want to have rapid growth rates, but they want to keep, the branch production in the lower part of the crown down. So, uh, just depends on what your objectives are, and in some cases, people may have different objectives in different parts of the stand.
All right, good answer. So this was one that I had promised you that I would ask, but someone else asked it before I did. Um, with this past weekend's ice storm, there was a lot of damage they felt to the oak trees in the Willamette Valley. Is there anything they can do through management to minimize the risk of ice damage? And here again, I thought the fingernail tree versus the hand tree. Any relationship there?
Yeah, generally we see less damage on the hand trees than the fingernail trees. And we actually had a pretty major ice storm in the South Puget Sound around 2011, I think. And in some cases, we had quite a bit of ice damage. And in the thin stands, we actually had less ice damage than in the thin. So, but I was surprised in some cases that there would be relatively large branches that did break off in the ice storm. And they, the branch could have been 50 years old or something. So it wasn't just something small. But on the other hand, in some cases, I'm sure there was rot in the branch, or just it was a very unbalanced tree, and there was just a huge amount of ice that formed on that branch. But it is definitely a shame to see something that's 100 years old or something, regardless of the species, and see it just in a few hours be greatly damaged by ice. But let's not give up. In a lot of cases, these trees, you can cut some of the worst of it off, and in some cases, breaking those branches off is going to provide better wildlife habitat, because it's going to be cavities that go into where those branches broke off. Um, so, it's it can be really sad to see when it happens, but down the road, it may not look as bad as you think it's going to when you first see it.
All right. We all need those words of hope after a storm like this one. So the next ones are a couple about acorns. Do you want to save those for the regeneration part, or do you want to talk them now?
If they're regeneration related, let's save them.
Okay. So then we got two more that aren't regeneration. So one is, I'll just read you this. My stand is solid white oak forest, no fir, a small smattering of ponderosa pine. We're in the eastern part of the range with open prairie and oaks only. So it sounds to me like around the Dalles, maybe. Interested in knowing about the virtue in thinning these oaks, the kind of the oak savanna kind of oaks.
So I've been to many of those stands in that, in the Columbia Gorge, and many of them are much denser than they were historically, and the crowns are much narrower. The understory species are very different. So again, it really comes down to what your goal is in the future, what time frame you're thinking of. But I've been to many oak stands that I think, based on what the landowners tell me they want for the future, they should be thinned.
All right. So here's another thinning question. If thinning the oaks themselves, consider using the oak stems for mushroom cultivation. So how about that? Are the oak stems from thinning good for mushroom cultivation?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, no, I've heard, I meant to mention that I've actually heard people talk about doing that, and I think it definitely can be done.
So this is another interesting one. People really like this hand versus the fingernail thing. So we have a couple of dozen of old hand large oaks Poison oak has invaded and climbed into the canopies with stalks, in some cases 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Woo! Is it best to remove, or is it harmless to the oaks? I know it's not harmless to me.
Well, um, in most cases, vines are not a problem for big old trees, whatever the species is, whether it's honeysuckle or poison oak or other things. But on the other hand, depending on what you're trying to favor in the stand in terms of other species of shrubs or understory species, uh, having massive amounts of the vines may be a problem. Um, I would tend to remove them just from an appearance sake if you only have a few of them, but it's not going to have a significant impact on the growth of the tree unless you had a tree that was already in very poor vigor and you had so much vine growth that it was actually shading some of the oak branches.
All right, interesting. So a couple questions about kind of the density management, the thinning. So could you elaborate on what you mean of being in favor of a heavy-handed thinning? And then the follow-up to that is, if you do a heavy-handed thinning, how about the increased availability of open ground for invasive species and problems that could happen there?
Yeah, this is a topic that I don't know if we have enough time. We might need to put it toward the end of the presentation. But just in brief, um, as I showed that one example, we removed 89% of the stems. A lot of people would say that was very heavy-handed, but it just depends on what you're starting for and what you want. I often tell people to go out and look at areas that they like. They say, oh, I'd like it to look like this, and look at how far apart the trees are. And then start thinking about, okay, well, what would that mean if I was going to thin to that level in my stand? And often people are thinking about, oh, it's going to be, trees are going to be 15, the stems are going to be 15 feet apart. But if you really want those hand trees, maybe they're going to be 30 feet apart. In terms of invasive species, yes, there's no question that both invasive and non-invasive species can be favored in the understory when you have a lot more open area. So that's just something that you need to think about how you would manage in the future. In some cases, you may have enough of an understory of shrubs that it's not going to be a major impact, but in other cases it will be, and that's just something that you need to either see what other people have done nearby and what kinds of problems they've had, or talk to natural resource professionals and say, what do you think is going to happen if we go in and we do a heavy thinning here? But definitely need to plan for the future.
All right. Well, we're going to stop there and let you go back. I just want to note that when we started that break, we had 9 questions. We're now ending the break. We still have 9 questions. They've been coming in good. So don't worry, there will be questions to do in another 15 or 20 minutes. So
Okay,
take
good.
it away, honey.
And I, sometimes I think, oh, it's kind of simple-minded to talk about the hand and the fingernails, but I'm really glad that people understand that how I'm trying to explain it, and people seem to grasp that. So I'm glad that
They
that's
grasp the hand. I like that.
Let's see. Okay, I'm working on it. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to talking about regeneration. And we did several trials in the early 2000s and published a booklet on identifying the best methods for establishing white oak seedlings in the Northwest. And this is another one that we reprinted. So email me if you'd like a paper copy. So just example of some that we had grown in our lath house. just an outdoor area with a roof on it. In this case, instead of talking about the crown, larger crowns mean better growth, now you need to think about underneath the ground that more roots equal better growth. So, we have classified seedlings with different levels of roots, and then we look to see how they grow. And there's a big difference in their growth rates based on their rooting. And so, just some examples. The one up on the top left is kind of what we would like them to look like. Have quite a bit of roots throughout where the potting mix was. The one on the right, the roots went down and then just circled around at the base of the pot. And I've seen this not just in kind of regular pots, but also when people try and grow them in like a milk, milk quart, or the old type of milk container or something like that. The roots go down and they just circle around at the bottom, and a lot of times when they get planted, these circled around roots don't plant very well and they get cut off, and you just don't have much of a root system left. And if you do, the root system that you have is going to be very unbalanced. Your roots are not going to grow out well because they're just circling around on the bottom. And the one with the little clippers, this is kind of hard to see, but kind of at the bottom part of the clippers, those are the roots. Those are the root systems on some oaks that we actually bought from a nursery. And I saw online that this nursery had oak seedlings, and I sent one of the people from my office down to buy a couple hundred seedlings, and he came back with these sticks, and I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. But I think what happens is that when they were being grown in a nursery bed, the taproot was going down deep, and then when they cut them to lift them, most of the root system was left in the ground. So if you're going to get them from a nursery that's growing them in a nursery bed, you need to ask them questions about, have they been undercut so that the trees have good roots, be able to actually look at some root systems before you're actually placing an order for any number, or talk to people who've bought from that nursery before. So if you're growing them yourself, you want to produce them so they have good root systems, but also you just need to be aware that sometimes people will sell them and they're just not very good. So one technique that we figured out was air pruning. So the one on the left was not air pruned, so it was the pot and the root system just kind of went around on the bottom. Whereas the one on the right was root pruned. And what we do is have a bottomless container. So we cut the bottom off the pot, and then we have it up on like a piece of hardware cloth, or some kind of metal mesh to prevent soil loss. But we have a spacer to create an air gap. So we've got some little spacers that have that little mesh up just a little bit above whatever the bench material is. And that's very effective in getting that air pruning from the bottom. So we're really getting a much better root system. So I mentioned that we've put in several different types of outplanting trials on different sites with different types of protectors, different types of vegetation control. We planted them in different soils and in different methods. Used a shovel, used a post hole digger. A couple times we've had the wonderful opportunity to use a tractor mounted auger. This is particularly wonderful if you have a very cobbly glacial soil. We've looked at different kinds of tree shelters and competition. We've also looked at fertilization, irrigation. In terms of shelters, we've looked at several different kinds. And in a shelter, sometimes we're trying to protect it from browsing, which is primarily deer, sometimes elk or other animals. But often we're also trying to protect the base of the stem um, from voles or gophers. And so when you're planting the shelter, you want to try and get it down into the very into the soil a few inches if you can, so it really helps protect the very base of the tree. So there's different types of mesh tree shelters. The one on the left is a Vexar, kind of standard one. The one in the middle is handmade from chicken wire, and the one on the right is handmade from some plastic mesh that came on a roll from a hardware store. You just cut it off and then use some wire or plastic tabs to hold it together. The Vexar is much cheaper and easy to apply, but it doesn't give you a very good form on the trees because the branches get very constrained. Solid wall tree shelters come in different sizes, different colors. Um, most of them are planted with an open top. Um, some in some areas, people have had trouble with birds getting into the shelters and having trouble getting out. And so this yellow one in the bottom, you can see a little bit of a plastic mesh. Some of these shelters, they either come with or you can buy a little plastic mesh that you just put on with a rubber band or something, just to hold it on to keep the birds from getting in there. Sometimes, particularly with the solid ones, you can get wasp nests inside there, and they're not creating a problem for the oak, but just for people, you need to be cautious that if you're going to be removing the shelters, I like to do it in the wintertime when wasps have died off. So just a few examples. Um, Graph on the left at one site, Glacial Heritage. You can see the difference in growth of year one, year two between a mesh shelter or solid shelter, and particularly the second year, those solid shelters, the tree growth is quite a bit more. And very similar at another site where we had no shelter versus a solid shelter. You really get the much better growth that second year in those solid shelters. But on the other hand, eventually those solid trees growing in the solid shelters are going to grow out the top, and then their growth rates will slow down. So, so you may get this big difference at year 2 or 3, but out at year 8 or 9, it may not make a difference. So, so I think they will still be an advantage to having some solid walled shelters, but it's a lot less than it looks like it's going to be early on. So control of competing vegetation is really important for early plant growth. You can control competing vegetation with, with a hoe or a mattock, or you can mow. You can use some type of organic shelter compost, or you can use a plastic shelter as shown in the upper left. And this plastic sheet is actually something designed for that purpose, and it has holes in it so that the water goes through. So lots of ways to control competing vegetation, as I just said. Weed wrenches are good for large shrubs like Scotch broom. Um, for plastic mulch, I'll show you some results. It can be very effective, but you need to make sure that the edges are secured um, so that the wind doesn't get a hold of it and rip it up. And also keep the hole very small and close to the stem. Otherwise, you get a lot of vegetation growing up right with the tree. So the vegetation right next to the stem is benefiting from your plastic mulch. Um, so just some examples, and here you can see in the picture we actually put landscape staples in the corners, but then we always have plenty of rocks around when we plant in the Puget Sound, and so we always put extra rocks down to. In some cases, you could have branches, logging debris or something, but really try and keep the edges of the plastic mulch down. So here we're looking at height growth and diameter growth the first couple of years, and you can see that the growth with the plastic mulch is much greater than with no growth. So what's plastic mulch doing? Basically, it's increasing the water supply in the soil late in the season. So in this case, you can see by the time we're getting to the middle of June, the soil water content is declining quickly, but it's declining much more quickly if you don't have any kind of weed control than if you have mulch or some other kind of weed control. So the benefit is this late June, July period, you're really gaining from having that mulch. So, and in addition to what you gain in height, in this case, looking 5 years down the road, maybe you haven't gained a huge amount in terms of having mulch versus no mulch, but you really had much less mortality. So with plastic mulch and some of these studies, we had about 5% mortality, and with no mulch, about 25%. So I know a lot of people don't like the concept of plastic mulch. They want to use organic material or do it in other ways, and that's fine, whatever works for you. If you do want to buy it, where can you get it? You can look online, garden stores, get it in long rolls that are perforated. But the important thing is to make sure that what you get has holes in it to allow the water to penetrate. So you don't want to get some kind of landscape material that's trying to block water from going through, but something that will actually do a good job in letting the water go through, but not the vegetation. And what some people do is they actually put down some type of mulch, plastic mulch, and then they cover it with an organic mulch because it looks nice, and also it does a good job in keeping the plants underneath from growing. So where can you find seedlings? These are just some examples of some places that you can search for seedlings. The one thing I always tell people is plan ahead. Don't think, oh, I'd like to plant next month, but think about in the summer, I want to plant next spring. So really try and plan ahead on your planting. And that, of course, that's true for all species. People ask about irrigation. We've tried a couple things, basically just taking gallon jugs and putting it right down next to the base of the tree. And what we found is if you have some kind of mulch, irrigated plants are going to grow better. But if you don't have mulch, you're not really going to gain much because all the other plants are going to take advantage of the water that you're going to be applying. So the purpose of irrigation, just like the purpose of the plastic mulch is really to extend available soil moisture into the midsummer. But you don't want to be continuing to irrigate on into the fall because you don't want the trees to keep growing. You want them to stop growing, have good buds set, and you really want to encourage cold hardiness. So sometimes you read things and they say, never irrigate oaks. And it's like, well, I think it's fine to irrigate oaks if you have the ability to do so, but stop by mid-August. And there's actually a cemetery that I've driven by many times that will irrigate um, on into October. And often in late August or September, I've gone and seen that the trees have burst bud again, and they've actually flowered in the fall. And then, of course, they're not going to flower in the spring because they've already used up their flower buds the previous summer. So whether it's a tree next to your yard, in your yard, or whether it's a planting that you're doing, if you're going to irrigate, only do it early in the summer. We tried different fertilization trials. We used Osmocote, which is a slow release, Osmocote Plus, slow release fertilizer time of planting. We would use the old little film canisters and scoop it in. We've also put it into tea bags. And we did 15 trials, and only one of them had a small increase in growth. So nutrients are generally not growth limiting on our sites for oaks, so it's not something that I think people need to worry about. So spacing, if you want to grow timber, then I'd try planting it around 10 by 10 feet, and you'll probably want to thin later. And close spacing will reduce the growth of lower branches. But if you want a woodland or a savanna, take some measurements in areas that look like what you want. We talked about this a little bit with the thinning. And you may want to plant at a 15, 20, 30 foot spacing. I know a lot of times people say, well, I'd rather plant more and thin later. And I'm like, well, that's fine if you're going to do it. But really think about what you want it to look like in the future. And also think about if you're going to have some equipment in are you going to mow, or are you going to, later when you're doing thinning, if you're going to have a tractor in there or something. So, think about if there is a particular spacing. Things don't have to be square spacings. They can be rectangular spacings, or they can be, irregular spacings where you have just, not trees on a square spacing, but you have clumps of trees in one area and not in another. So direct seeding, people often ask about direct seeding. We've had very poor luck with direct seeding. The animals tend to remove the acorns very quickly, a whole range of animals. We worked with some people at one point that had some cameras, and it was amazing how many different species would come and go after the acorns. And it could be, different birds, it could be squirrels, it could be, voles. But actually there were bears that came and got some acorns. So, but I understand sometimes people want to direct seed. Either they want to reproduce from a tree that is, from their trees, and they want to avoid having to go through and growing the seedlings and planting them. So if you do want to seed, plant deeply. Don't just put them in an inch or two because the animals will come and dig them up. And consider putting a kind of a metal mesh cage over the top of where you sow, at least some of them, to reduce animal theft. You should seed in the fall when the acorns are ripe, and oak germinates in the fall. And so it really gets its roots established, so it'll have much better growth in the spring if you get it planted in the fall. If you do store acorns after you plant, keep them cool and moist, like in a Ziploc bag in the refrigerator. Um, and don't keep them there too long. Get them planted. So you need to pick the largest acorns for the best results. Um, People ask about insect holes. Well, it's nice not to have any, but it's not uncommon to have a few. And if you have generally one or two insect holes, I think it's fine. You're still going to have pretty good growth potential for the acorn. But you want to, as much as possible, sow before germination occurs. And it can occur in your refrigerator. um, but what you really want is to get either no germination before you sow them, or just a tiny bit, because if you have this long root coming out, it usually gets broken when you try and plant it, and uh, it's often very difficult for the acorn to form a new root at that point, and so often it it either makes a very weak root and a poor seedling, or it just doesn't grow. So you really want to have, no germination, or just a tiny little bit showing when you put them in the ground. So I say small early trials can show you which trees produce larger seedlings. There is genetic variation. If you happen to um, have a few trees that you're collecting acorns from, consider keeping the acorns separate, and then say, okay, the ones I planted over here came from tree one, and the ones over here from tree two. And if you see that after a few years tree two is the seedlings are much larger, then think about in the future collecting more from tree two. In general, the survival rates planting, both planting for planting, not for sowing, but for planting, are pretty high, with a solid shelter being better than no shelter, mulch much better than no mulch. Sources of mortality, primarily rodents, um, overtopping by vegetation, very poor soil. In some cases, you do get browsing, and you could get browsing year after year. It's not so much a source of mortality as the fact that um, the seedling just doesn't get going. I mean, 10 years later, you can still have something that's less than knee high because it's been browsed so many times. So soil water is the key to establishment. Um, uh, so in the fall, if you're going to plant in the fall, or at least by February. Have some kind of competition control if you can. Maintain those plantings. Anticipate what kind of problems you're going to have in terms of other, non-native species, or browsing, and see how you can design your planting program to avoid those as much as possible. But one thing I found interesting about oak is there's a lot of genetic variation. And so in these trials, each one of these dots is a tree. And each one of these was a different site. So if you look at this HM03, that was one of our plantings in 2003. And we had a lot of trees that grew had almost no growth, but then we had some that actually grew quite well. So just a lot of variation sometimes, more than what I've seen in other species. And I think part of it is because they can survive for a long time. So you can end up with trees that are growing very poorly but still survive, as opposed to other species. Those poor growing seedlings may not survive. So here we have a happy sapling. So I just wanted to briefly talk about some insects and diseases. And this is a nice 158-page book that's available online, and this is listed, the link to it is listed in the resource document, which you'll have. I'll just mention a few kind of more common insects. So these scales, um, you can end up with a lot of tip dieback, late leaf out, some sprouting. Mortality's rare, but it definitely is going to impact growth. And just looking close up, to see these scales, you really need to look carefully on the branches. You can see these little raised rings on the bark, and see the little scales when you look closely. The damage and mortality seems to be more common on the edge of stands than on open grown trees. So in this case, you can see some of the trees on the left are really getting a lot of wind exposure, and the damage from that organism, that scale, is more common. Have a lot of different types of moths and insects that can cause problems. Different loopers, different caterpillars. There's several different species of caterpillars, western tent caterpillar, Pacific forest. The outbreaks are generally short-lived and trees recover, but I have seen circumstances where some areas are hit year after year, and heavy defoliation can cause dieback. I've never heard of it actually killing a tree, but I'm sure that it does kill a few weak trees. There are different kinds of diseases, but generally they're not a big problem. You'll see some cankers, some mildew. There's a root disease, armillaria. But Oregon white oak is resistant to sudden oak death, and it's less susceptible to oak wilt than other oaks. So we're lucky in that regard that it just isn't susceptible or has resistance to some of these other important diseases on other oaks. I always think these oak galls, are really interesting, caused by wasps, these synipid wasps. They're generally not a problem, they're just kind of interesting. Some of them are quite large galls, sometimes little tiny ones, some on the twigs, mostly on the leaves. Changing topics again, cost share programs. So some years the NRCS has cost share programs to cover some oak activities. These could be both planting and thinning. So you need to check with your local USDA service center. In general, in order to qualify for these programs, you need to have a forest management or stewardship plan, or have shown that you've invested in oak management in the past, in planting or stand improvement. This is a very busy slide. I'm almost to the end here, but the whole purpose of this is just to say forestry regulations in general were not designed for oaks. So, but there are rules, forestry regulations. So you really need to talk to your local forestry. So your Oregon Department of Forestry stewardship forester to talk about, what level of thinning or what level of conifer removal you want to do. In some cases, it's fine as long as it's a small percentage of your ownership, or there may be some areas that you can designate as non-forestry, even though they are forestry, but you may be able to work with these different regulations in order to be able to manage your stand the way you want and still be within the rules. So just some other resources. This is kind of an interesting book on oak restoration strategies. This is was developed for national forests east of the Cascades, but may be of interest to people who have some of these drier oak areas. And the link to this is in the resources file. Um, I've mentioned wildlife a couple times. Oaks are often a hot spot for wildlife. Cavities in the bole or large branches, crevices in the bark support insects, lichens, moss, um, produce acorns. Open areas, other species benefit, shrubs and many ground plants. Um, so as I mentioned with the breaking of branches due to ice, one silver lining is that those cavities in the bole will often be utilized by wildlife very quickly. And there are several very nice publications available on wildlife and habitat interactions. These are also listed in your resources file. This one by Klamath Bird, and this one um, American Bird Conservancy has really nice information on both the different types of oak habitats and then which different species of birds, um, what they like in terms of habitat. So we've been doing work on oak for quite a while, and we have a list of oak publications and on our website, and those are also available in the resource file. So I think I'll stop there, and Mike will.
Excellent. We do have some questions, but before we get to them, Connie, I want to tell people that we have a poll that we're going to do, and I'd like you to go ahead and go to the next slides because our last two slides are advertising for future programs. So I will put the poll up and kind of move it off to the side so you all can see the slides and the polls. But we have one on March 2nd and then another one on February 18th. And they're both good, and I would encourage you. So our wrap-up poll, you don't have to, we're not going to go over the responses. So just go ahead and fill it out, and you can do it, move it off to the side so you can still see what you want to see, and we'll continue with the questions. But we have, again, March 2nd is Alicia Christensen and Eric Farm talking about choosing the right forestry professional, and as part of the Tree School Online series. And on February 18th, which is this Thursday, Thomas Stokely, who is the new extension agent in Central Oregon, is also a wildlife guy, is going to talk about managing Eastern Oregon forest for wildlife. So go ahead and leave those up, Connie. You all do the poll, and we will stay for a few minutes to get through these questions. So we're going to go zoom. So this one's from Bruce Bull. I've been encouraging naturally propagating oaks. When thinning small 18-inch tall ones, I noticed the roots have been eating on some of those that I pull out. Is that true? Or is there something else impacting the roots? Sounds like your gopher.
It could very well be gopher. In some cases, we also have voles that eat the roots. So this depends on where you are, and you can sometimes figure out what it is based on what kinds of mounds that you see, or how close to the surface the damage is, and things like that. But generally, those are probably the two main ones: voles and gophers.
All right, good one. So this is one from, I got to tell you, we have the farthest away one. This is the person not from the US. Simon Jastrowski is from Poland. In Poland, it's now about 1 o'clock in the morning and he's still asking questions. So he's watching the Late Late Show. Could you tell something about 60-second acorn counting? How do you do that?
So we scan the tree. Uh, the, the the actual protocol is written down, and we borrowed a protocol from some people in California. But basically, we scan the tree with binoculars until we come to the first acorn, and then we start timing, and we keep scanning until 30 seconds have gone by. So, but there is, it's been a while since I've actually done it, but there is some rule about how long you scan before you decide that there aren't any acorns. So, uh, but it's a way that you don't get bogged down with um, trying to estimate the area of the crown and then how many per unit area, or go around different sides of the tree. Sometimes people will do a 60-second or 30-second count on like both the north and the south side of the tree. It just depends on how much time you have and how much interest you have in trying to get more information on actual acorns on the tree.
All right. Good one. So this next one has to do with when you were talking about clumps, which the person wanted to know, did you mean sprouts from a common stump? Is that what you're talking about? And if you have sprouts from a common stump, can you thin them out and leave some, or do you have to just treat that whole thing as a plant?
So in many cases, when we see these clumps, we assume that they um, came from um, that there had been a stump there before and they sprouted. But that's not always true. In some cases, there may have been more than one tree got established and close to each other. So actually, for research purposes, we call something a clump if it's within a meter, 3 feet of each other. We call it a clump for our purposes. But in many cases, those clumps um, did have us, all came from the same basic root system. But yes, you can favor, cut some in the clump and leave others. So you don't have to do a all or nothing.
Good. So this is an interesting question. Any studies on the change in mycorrhizae after the thinning? And here both talk about thinning just in pure oak stands or in a mixed Doug fir oak stand when you remove the Doug fir. And that's the one I think would have some impact on mycorrhiza.
We have not looked at mycorrhizae in relation to thinning. Um, we do have a publication that we did with Darlene Southworth where we collected soil and roots on different stands and sent them to her. And she documented which species were present. And there are quite a few different species. And, it appears that the mycorrhizae can survive for a long time, but eventually you will end up with, a more conifer dominated kind of root biota as opposed to, a more oak dominated biota. And the same is true for things above ground. So sometimes people say, oh, it's really pretty to see all these ferns and moss on the oaks. And it's like, sure, if you think they're pretty, that's fine, but they're not necessarily characteristic of a classic oak stand, which has a lot more airflow and a lower humidity, in which case you would have, very different lichens and very different epiphytes. So I know sometimes we go out places and people will say, well, what do you think of this? And it's like, well, what do you want it to be? It's not like something is good or bad, but it just depends on what you'd like it to be.
So speaking of good or bad, we had a number of questions about mistletoe. Is that good or bad? And can you thin to favor and not favor mistletoe?
Well, interestingly, if you don't like mistletoe, I think somewhere there's a line around, I can't remember where it is on the interstate. But anyway, just you get north of there and there's no mistletoe. So there's no mistletoe in Washington. There's no mistletoe in British Columbia or even in northern Oregon. Um, I don't think it has a major impact on the growth rates. Um, I've heard people say from um, you know, a landscaping perspective, sometimes they cut out the mistletoe, but I've never heard of anyone actually being able to effectively manage mistletoe in an oak stand. Usually, if you have the mistletoe, it's pretty widely distributed, and um, so I wouldn't put much effort into trying to manage mistletoe. I don't think it's really
All
much.
right. Or worry about it. Unless you want to stand under it at Christmas time, right?
Right, exactly.
It's got a good thing. So this is an interesting one. So Kelly Moore asks, we have a bunch of poison hemlock growing under the canopy of our beautiful 100-year-old oaks. What's the best way to get rid of the hemlock without hurting the oaks?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. That's a tough one. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can check with, maybe the local NRCS or extension people in that area may have an idea of what would be a good control measure, but it's not my area of expertise.
All right. Well, I think we're going to stop it there. We've gone to 4:45, and I want to thank you, Connie, and I want to thank the audience. You hung in there really well. We had about 60 people at the max. We're down to about 30 now, going into overtime, but gets towards dinner time, and people want to go eat. Again, check your resource guide that's listed in the chat, and it will be posted soon. Please come to more webinars, and thank you all. And thank you, Connie. Any final words?
Remember the hand versus the fingernails.
I like that. I think we will. All right. Thank you very much. Everyone, have a good evening. Drive safely.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.